Welcome to the ACC Panic Room alongside a very festive Lauren Brownlow. I'm Joe Ovies. Tar Heels finally notched a win. It's finally, it's like what, December 18th today. And we're in that weird hand-wringing mode when it comes to the Tar Heels, understandably, because there was huge expectations for a preseason #1, Lauren. But this was a win that people had been looking for against a tournament team, a ranked team, a good
hmm
team, an opportunity for them in the Garden, no less. And they did it in very dramatic fashion. Now the question is whether or not this win might be the thing that catapults them back to where we saw them at the end of last year.
I mean, I think, look, it's the margin of error is so thin, right? And I mean, I've written about this, I've talked about it. Last year in a lot of their quad one chances, they got like blown out. Right
Hmm.
now, they got beaten by a decent enough margin at Virginia Tech but without Armando Bacot. Like they went to 4 overtimes with a top 10 Alabama team. I'm not saying they've looked great. Those are different conversations. I'm saying the
Hmm.
results alone were not that much of a cause for panic. Like the 4 teams in the quad one they lost to were all pretty solid. And, there was no, I guess Indiana came the closest, but there was no like Kentucky-esque performance from last year where they
No,
just got completely
no.
worked the whole game, no fight, no nothing. And that's the other thing I think that impressed me yesterday, because what we hadn't seen yet from Carolina is we had not seen them. We'd seen them get down and maybe like try to get back in it and almost get back in it at times in some of those games, and not, they would get it close, but they couldn't get over the hump. And that was my
Hmm.
concern watching them with that Ohio State offense, is like they weren't going to be able to get enough stops. Like, I'm like, it's not going to happen. Ohio State's offense was ranked 5th in KenPom coming in, and it looked it. Like they've got
Yeah,
a
it did.
bunch of they got a bunch of dudes that can score on that team. They got like everyone on that roster is 6'6". It's so weird, except the point guard and their big guy. But yeah,
Yeah,
like
when Ohio State came through Cameron Indoor Stadium, that was one of my immediate takeaways when everybody was out there warming up was to say, "Wow, this is a really tall matchup between two tall teams. It's they're a big team."
they're both tall and not tall though, because they only have one guy that's 6'8" in their
Hmm.
rotation. Almost like they're tall because everybody else almost is 6'6", right? Like that's where
Right.
it kind of hit me, because I'm like, oh, Carolina will have a size advantage, and then I'm like, oh no, they won't,
No.
because that's the thing. And you saw that at times with their guards being a little overwhelmed in the first half. And I think like like I said, what you hadn't seen is Carolina be able to like fight through it and get over the hump. And I think we saw that last year. Them being able to do that in some situations kind of helped get them over the hump then. So who knows? I mean, you can't really compare it to last year anyway. I think we're
Well,
past
there are
that
some
point.
things. I feel like there are some things that you can compare, and I think there are some things that are
Yeah.
going to hold true for North Carolina this season. The biggest one being, as Caleb Love goes, this team is going to go. I say that knowing that R.J. Davis had an incredible end of regulation sequence, both
Yes.
defensively and big shots. But you balance that with the fact that Caleb Love is also still wasting shots. Dude was out there with tired legs, jacking up shots, and that's just you can't change that. That's just kind of who he is right now. Sometimes it's going to pay off for you, other times it's going to hurt you. And I thought that Caleb
Well,
Love was
but
hurting him last night.
to your point though, they did make a point to get it into RJ's hands down the
They
stretch, and
did.
that was
They
big,
did.
because I was wondering about that. I'm like, if they leave this ball in Caleb's hands, he is going to. And I'm not saying like this is a bad thing. He was trying to take over and win them the
Yeah.
game, essentially. It's not like he hasn't done that before, but he was exhausted. They've been pressing in that game. He
Hmm.
played most of it. Like,
Oh,
and you
I,
could
I
see
want
his
to be.
shots, his threes missing, like front rim. Like, oh, I was like, maybe it won't even get to the rim on the next one. I'm not sure.
Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that they shouldn't let Caleb Love do these things, right? I'm
Right, but
simply
he doesn't
saying
always know when it's not.
yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Sometimes somebody has to tell him or he has to understand it ain't me tonight. And RJ
or
was
like
able to
right
take
now in
over.
this moment, even. Yeah.
Or right, right. So I think but that's something that's not going to change, and that's going to be a variable for the Tar Heels going forward. The other thing that they sorely miss is Brady Manick's shooting, which we know. And that's why I guess the end of game sequence, end of regulation sequence, which I know a lot of people have written up, kind of an on the fly thing. I saw Matt Norlander's piece on CBSSports.com where like Armando Bacot was somewhat skeptical of what they were trying to do there at the end. But Pete Nance played it
Oh, at the end of
perfectly
overtime?
at the
Yeah.
at the end of regulation that got into overtime. The Pete Nance thing to get into overtime. So to
Oh, yeah,
me,
yeah.
I think it's they were looking for Pete Nance to finally kind of find his way into this team. But I think that still he's not Brady Manic is the point.
No,
And that guy was making threes all the time, and you see their perimeter shooting has taken a dive so far this season. And then there's the
that's a
bigger thing,
concern.
right? That's a
Yeah.
concern. But then there's the other thing too. And it's you talk about it defensively, right? Let's just cut to the chase with what Hubert Davis was saying at halftime, apparently, and what he tried to do a nicer job of doing post game. It wasn't
Hmm.
lost on me that on the CBS broadcast, I forget the sideline reporter's name, pardon me on that one, but she's like, yeah, I talked to Hubert, blah, 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 blah. I told them they were soft. Okay. Like, I'm not saying that. That's not a Twitter thing. Like,
No.
she's paraphrasing what Hubert said. Like, I called them soft. And like every other thing that came after the game, whether it was from Armando Bacot post game, whether it was Hubert post game, was all more a polite way of saying it. Like, oh, we challenged their toughness. What's your season going to
Well,
be about?
Armando said he told us we were getting punked.
Yes, yes, yes. We're getting punked, right?
I was like,
So
well, accurate. You were getting punked.
it is, and that would be the concern. But the question is, why is this happening? Is it and this I don't know the answer to, and only they know the answer to this, right? Because what do we always talk about defensively? It's a want to factor, right? It's not necessarily a skill. You have to want to be good at defense. Something that Roy Williams preached all the time.
Right. You can
I
make
don't.
stuff happen on the defensive end, even if you're not as athletic as ideally you'd like to be. That's
Yep.
for sure. But there is still like only a certain level you can go without some of that like athleticism and length that say like
Oh,
elite
sure,
people
sure,
have.
sure, sure. So my question for the Tar Heels, and I don't know, we don't know the answer to this, is it's understandably difficult to come off the high of last year and then basically not run the table, but keep it going, keep the foot on the gas. We've seen this out of Carolina teams in the past, and that's why you just go, okay, well,
To
these
take it for
Carolina
granted.
teams, these Carolina teams that went from, hey, we didn't finish the job, let's come back and do this, you see them play a particular way and they put the hammer down. For whatever reason, this group hasn't necessarily done that. And there's almost like you know what, let's fast forward to March so we can flip the switch on again. That's me speculating, but that's kind of what I've seen. And Hubert Davis calling them soft or they got punked is more of an indication to me like, what are you guys about? Do you guys want to go out there and be a dominant team? Do you want to be a true championship contender? This ain't the NBA. So I think that's Hubert's learning this too, and I like the way that the team responded in this
Yeah.
game.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what we saw last year out of them was a very improved defensive team down the stretch. Like they were able to make things happen defensively, which we saw some in the second half, although they needed to press to do it. But I get it. Like you're down, you've got to make stuff happen. You have no choice really. And they were able to force some turnovers and kind of shift things back in their direction. But I feel like the other thing you saw that was a concern and then a good thing in the second half was like, I mean, Ohio State is a great offensive rebounding team, like a great one. They're like 9th in the country or something. But at the same time, like every offensive rebound, every loose ball, like Ohio State was getting to it in the first half. And you just were looking at Carolina and you're like, are you guys okay? And it just kind of felt like they're either going to fold in the second half and get blown out or they're going to find some fight. And they did. Like it was a weird game of runs in the first half and really throughout most of it. It was so strange. It was like one team would go on a run, then the other team would go on a run. And it was like, it wasn't really like back and forth almost until the end. But they, that's the thing is they found a way to make things happen. And that was kind of the difference down the stretch last year is they made things happen rather than, I think Hubert even talked about this some last year, like waiting for things to happen for them.
Right.
And,
right.
But to your point, like, yeah, like why are they still doing this? I don't know. They're 18 to 22. And like you said, well, I don't even know. Is Armando older than that? He probably is now. You know how
he's like
excited
our
I
age.
get
He's
when I
our
see
age.
players.
Armando's our age now.
Stop it. At heart, he is, yes.
Yes.
You know how excited I get when I see like players born in the 90s still on teams? I'm like, oh, thank God.
I know.
So, but yeah, like I just think it's they're figuring out, I guess maybe this is the wake-up call they needed, or maybe they go out and
Maybe.
play terribly against Michigan. Like, who's to say? Because just
Well,
like last year.
I'm glad you brought up Michigan, because right now the way the ACC is going, it's not like the Tar Heels are going to get a lot of opportunities to bolster themselves in the league. And they got Michigan coming up next.
That's
Speaking
not a
of,
quad one, though. I don't. As of last time I looked, it's not a quad one.
it's not,
Even on a
it's
neutral
not, it's
court,
not.
which
But
is
still,
very not great
quad one or not, it's a good non-conference win if they can
for
get it.
sure.
I
Agreed.
think that ultimately matters. Speaking of opportunities, NC
Ugh.
State. NC State doesn't
Yes.
have a lot of opportunities, which is why last night against Vanderbilt was key. So if I told you, Lauren, before you even watched that game, yeah, by the way, Terquavion's he's going to get some points, but it's going to be I think he had like 20 shots, 16 points on 20 shots.
I would
So
be like, yeah.
Terquavion Smith, that's not great. I think Jarkel Joner also had a pretty soft night last night too in terms of overall impact. That NC State's fortunes were going to change on DJ Burns. How would you think
My
that was
whole
going to go for the
heart. I
Wolfpack last
love
night?
him so much. My favorite local player so far this year. I'm not even joking. I think
Yes.
like I have an affinity for NC State big men that
Mm-hmm.
have a little, junk in the trunk. And I mean on a personal level, not like on that kind of level. I love BJ Anya, flaws and all, I love, and I love Burns. Like, he's fantastic.
This is why
watching
if people want to understand, if you've been longtime ACC Panic Room watchers, if you want to understand why Brownlow loved Bonzie Colson so much,
part of the
why?
reason, yeah.
I mean, he was a fun player to watch, but he was thick with two C's.
I have a thing with like basketball players that look like football players. I just find them fascinating. Like, it's probably why like LeBron's always been one of my favorites, because he looks like he could play football. And half of Ohio State's roster, by the way, looked like they could suit up for the Buckeyes in the bowl game if they need some help.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
that's true. But Burns last night, 6 of 9 shooting. More importantly, down the stretch, when they had come back and rallied in this game to take a lead, 6 of 6 from the free throw line. So
yeah.
that's key for NC State.
And I think he had a season high in minutes, right? Which is also huge.
Pretty
it was up
sure
there.
he played 28 minutes last night.
That's big for him too.
Last night.
Yeah.
Very, very big, very big. So with NC State's tough to talk about for a lot of NC State fans, because every question that I put the Hey Joe question out there for the show, and everything's about Kevin Keats, and I understand why.
They don't want to get hurt again either. I think that's part of it. It's like, why get your hopes up? Yeah.
There's probably that too. And the way they started out ACC play was just like that, with losses to Pitt and Miami. And Giulio and I talk about this plenty. We've talked about it plenty this week. And that's the theme, I guess, about both Carolina and NC State in this panic room, is the opportunities. Again, ACC is not going to give you a lot of them. The Wolfpack had a golden opportunity against Kansas at that time when they could be had. They played them well, and it was followed up by decent wins over Dayton and Butler. So when you get into this particular stretch with Vanderbilt and then Clemson coming up, that's where your opportunities are. Now, I skipped over the next game. Here's what you can't do if you're NC State. Thursday, you can't lose to Louisville. You can't do that.
Yeah. And the thing is, you know what Louisville's done lately?
Yeah.
Show slight signs of life.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen regardless. Like, it's not like they were like blowing anybody out. They beat Florida A&M by 4, but a win's a win. And like, I'm sure that has to feel a lot better for them.
Lauren, with NC State, you never know. Especially on the defensive end with NC State, you just never know. I'll say this: so Thursday, PNC Arena. I'm going to go to that game. Friday is Festivus. If NC State loses, there will be an airing of grievances for 3 hours on the show. I'm just saying.
Come on, State fans better than that. They'll air their grievances just fine, even if they win.
That's a fair point.
Because then it'll be like, oh, you beat Louisville, big deal. Like, if they struggle with Louisville at all, forget it.
Yeah.
There'll be plenty of grievances.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the ACC Panic Room. We will see you all later in the week.